Hello and good afternoon. My name is Dansie, but please call me Nicole. Does anyone here remember when math was easy, when it didn't have all of those x's and y's, integration, anti-differentiation, parametrics, and all that good old nonsense? Does anyone here remember these? Remember how easy math was when we used these things? Maybe it's just me. Today I'm using these to help me illustrate a rather grim point. This block here represents the general population, all of us, humanity as a whole. This block is you and me and everyone you've ever known and all of the people you don't know. And this block, these blocks, are the statistically representative amount of people we can expect to attempt suicide each year. That's 4%, or actually 3.9, according to a study performed by the World Health Organization in 2005. 3.9. It's actually a relatively small portion of the entire population, less than 4 out of every 100 people. But in fact, it is larger than the entirety of the transgender population, which can be represented as this. It's actually less than half of that little block, 0.3%. This is where it gets dark. If that is the entire transgender community, then this is the amount of transgender people we can expect to attempt suicide each year. According to the Williams Institute study of gender and suicide, the suicide rate amongst the transgender community is 40%. 40%. It's astronomical. The suicide rate for this small little sliver of humanity is more than 10 times as high as the general population. And this rate includes the stories of LaShonda Marie Brockington, or Blake, as he preferred to be called, an American openly transgender teen who threw himself in front of interstate traffic. He was 18 at the time of his death. And Lucy Meadows, born Nathaniel Upton, a transgender teacher in Northeast England. He, like me, was a man who dressed as a woman. But unlike me, he eventually transitioned to a woman undergoing hormone therapy and sexual reassignment surgery. She killed herself 3 months after her surgeries were finished using carbon monoxide gas. These numbers are taken from a study, from a US study, but the issue of transgender suicide exists all across the world. The suicide rate is consistent among the transgender community. This is truly an internationally felt issue that requires global action. Now, according to the National Alliance on Mental Illness, it has been found that around 90% of people who commit suicide were experiencing a mental illness at the time of their death. Until fairly recently, transgenderism, or gender dysphoria, was considered a mental disorder by almost all psychiatric professionals, and still is today by some. But unfortunately for the transgender community, the mental disorder is poorly understood and poorly treated across the globe. The only two options provided to transgender people by the medical professionals is gender reassignment therapy and counseling. They are almost never offered antipsychotics, therapies, or antidepressants, despite the fact that statistically 2 out of every 5 transgender people will take their own life. If gender reassignment therapy was an effective means to treat gender dysphoria, then we could logically conclude that the suicide rate post-operation would be drastically lower than the pre-operation. Note how in several instances it goes up by 4 to 5 times as much. The suicide rate is, for the most part, unaffected by gender reassignment therapy, and when it does change, it gets worse. Only in female to male does the suicide rate decrease after reassignment therapy in any notable way. Yet, the suicide rate still increases from those who have had it, from those who do not want it. Clearly, the current means of treatment for transgenderism is ineffective in reducing the suicide rate, and in fact does the opposite of the goal. If it is the medical profession's goal to keep people alive, safe, and healthy, they have failed the transgender community in an enormous way. Now, there are those that claim that the high suicide rate amongst the transgender community is the result of the discrimination transgender people face on a day-to-day basis. And I will not lie, that is a huge issue facing our society, and it needs to be dealt with. But in order for that reasoning to work, there has to be a statistically validated link between discrimination and suicide rates. But no such link exists. So what can be done? It's a question that's tugged at me since I started research into transgenderism. Clearly, the prevailing method of treating gender dysphoria is ineffective. It cannot be treated efficiently with reassignment surgery. It does not work. The supposed means of treatment only makes the suicide rate worse. My solution is twofold. First, legitimate, unbiased attempts have to be made to understand transgenderism. We need to be able to understand the disorder significantly better than we do now. Schizophrenia was not understood for many years, and doctors treated mentally ill patients with inhumane treatments. But over the years, it came to be better understood and more humanely and effectively treated. Psychiatric doctors have to spend time with transgender patients and work towards effectively treating it in the future. They need to acknowledge gender dysphoria as a mental disorder and work to treat it as such. This, in time, will help lower the suicide rate as the medical community begins to understand how the transgender mind works. The second and more controversial aspect of my solution is to stop all medical practice of the gender reassignment surgery and hormone replacement therapy as a means to treat gender dysphoria. The scientific and medical communities need to reevaluate its method for helping transgender people. The current method is clearly ineffective at actually helping people and in fact opposes progress into actually solving the issue. These changes must be implemented in order to protect and help these people who are already downtrodden and discriminated against members of society.